If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to the channel. Chapter 1: The Making of a Warrior Queen. Part 1: The Dilemma of Succession. King Gajapati Devi sat in his royal chamber at Warangal, staring at maps that showed his mighty kingdom. The Kakatiya dynasty had ruled these lands for generations. His armies controlled vast territories from the eastern coast to the western hills. But one problem kept him awake at night. He had no son to inherit his throne. In the year 1250, this was not just a family problem. It was a disaster waiting to happen. Medieval Indian kingdoms followed strict rules. Only men could become kings. Only men could lead armies into battle. Only men could command the respect of feudal lords who controlled smaller territories within the empire. Gajapati's relatives watched and waited. His nephews and cousins whispered among themselves. They believed one of them deserved the crown when the old king died. Some even began making secret deals with neighboring kingdoms. The enemies circling the Kakatiya border sensed weakness. The Yadava rulers in the northwest had always wanted more land. They controlled parts of modern Karnataka and Maharashtra. Their spies reported back that Gajapati had no male heir. Perfect timing for an invasion. To the south, the Pandya kings of Tamil Nadu also heard the news. They had been fighting the Kakatiyas for control of coastal trading ports. A succession crisis would give them the chance to grab more territory. The eastern Gangas posed another threat. These rulers controlled parts of Odisha and constantly tried to expand westward into Kakatiya lands. Without a strong king to resist them, they could march deeper into the empire. The feudal system made everything worse. Hundreds of small chiefs and lords owed loyalty to the Kakatiya throne. They provided soldiers and paid taxes in return for protection. But their loyalty depended on strength. If they thought the next ruler would be weak, they might rebel or switch sides. Inside the palace, ministers debated frantically. Some suggested adopting a male relative as heir. Others proposed marrying one of Gajapati's daughters to a powerful ally who could rule in the family name. Every solution seemed to have dangerous flaws. Gajapati grew more desperate as months passed. Enemy armies tested his borders with small attacks. Vassal lords delayed sending their annual tributes. The kingdom that had taken generations to build could collapse within years. Then the king looked at his daughter Rudrama. She was intelligent, brave, and already showed interest in military matters. An impossible idea began forming in his mind. What if he broke every rule and tradition? What if he made his daughter his heir? The very thought seemed crazy. No major Indian kingdom had ever been ruled by a woman. The nobles would be outraged. The priests would call it against divine law. But as external threats grew stronger, this impossible solution started looking like the only way to save his dynasty. Part 2: An Unconventional Decision. King Gajapati Devi made a choice that stunned his entire kingdom. He decided to train his daughter Rudrama not as a princess, but as a future king. This had never been done before in any major Indian dynasty. But the old king saw no other option if his kingdom was to survive. He called his most trusted advisor, Minister Sivadevaya, to his private chambers. "I want you to train Rudrama as you would train any prince," the king told him firmly. "Teach her everything a ruler needs to know." Sivadevaya was shocked at first. Training a girl in warfare and statecraft went against every tradition they knew. But he also understood the desperate situation they faced. From the age of 10, Rudrama's life changed completely. While other noble girls learned music and dance, she learned sword fighting. Every morning before dawn, she practiced with heavy weapons until her arms ached. Guru Sivadevaya taught her to shoot arrows with deadly accuracy and to ride horses like a seasoned warrior. She learned to fight with multiple weapons and to command groups of soldiers. But physical training was only part of her education. The young princess spent hours learning military strategy, studying how great kings had won battles and lost kingdoms. She learned about trade routes, taxation, and how to keep different regions of an empire united. Suvadevaya made her memorize the names and loyalties of every major feudal lord in their territory. The palace buzzed with whispers and complaints. Conservative nobles were horrified. "This goes against our sacred traditions," they muttered to each other. Hindu priests declared it was against divine law for a woman to rule. Some threatened to withdraw their support from the king entirely. Several powerful relatives of the royal family openly criticized Ganapati's decision. They argued that they should be considered as heirs instead of a mere girl. Court gatherings became tense affairs where nobles would pointedly ignore Rudrama or make cutting remarks about her training. But Ganapati Devi refused to back down. He had seen his daughter's intelligence and determination. When she was 12, Rudrama defeated boys twice her age in sword practice. She could analyze battle formations better than experienced generals. Her memory for administrative details amazed court officials. Slowly, some skeptics began to change their minds. They watched her lead mock military exercises with confidence and precision. She settled disputes between merchants with wisdom beyond her years. Even hardened soldiers started showing her genuine respect after seeing her skill with weapons. The transformation was remarkable. By her 15th birthday, Princess Rudrama had become someone entirely different. She walked like a warrior, spoke like a commander, and thought like a strategist. She had mastered every skill needed to rule a kingdom in the violent medieval world. This careful preparation would soon be put to the ultimate test, as growing external threats forced Ganapati to make his most daring decision yet. Part 3. The Coronation that shocked the Deccan. The year 1259 CE marked the end of an era in the Deccan. King Ganapati Devi lay dying in his chambers at Warangal, surrounded by worried ministers and anxious relatives. The great Kakatiya Empire needed a new ruler, and everyone knew who the king had chosen. But knowing and accepting were two different things. Word spread quickly through the capital that Princess Rudrama would be crowned within days. The announcement sent shockwaves through the kingdom. Feudal lords gathered in small groups, whispering their concerns. Never before had a woman ruled the Kakatiyas. Never before had any major kingdom in the Deccan been governed by a female monarch. The grand hall of Warangal fort was prepared for the ceremony with unusual care. Golden silk banners hung from the walls, but the atmosphere felt tense rather than celebratory. Hundreds of nobles, vassals, and feudatory chiefs arrived from across the empire. Many came reluctantly, unsure what this change would mean for their own power and territories. On the morning of the coronation, something unexpected happened. Princess Rudrama did not appear in traditional royal robes worn by queens. Instead, she walked into the hall dressed as a warrior king. She wore military attire, a sword at her side, and her hair tied in the style of male rulers. The assembled crowd fell silent, unsure how to react. The court priest began the ancient rituals, but even his voice carried uncertainty. As the ceremony progressed, Rudrama made another shocking declaration. She would not rule as Rani Rudrama Devi. Instead, she would take the masculine title Rudradeva Maharaja, presenting herself to the world as a king, not a queen. This bold move was calculated and clever. By adopting male identity and titles, she was telling everyone that she intended to rule with the same authority and strength as any male monarch. She would lead armies, make war, and command absolute loyalty, just like her predecessors. The moment of truth came when feudatory lords were called to pledge their allegiance. One by one, powerful chiefs who controlled vast territories approached the throne. Their faces showed a mixture of surprise, doubt, and calculation. Some hesitated before bowing, clearly wrestling with the unprecedented situation. Yet none dared openly refuse. The memory of Ganapati Devi's power was still fresh, and Rudrama's own military skills were already well known among the nobles. The ceremony continued, though the usual enthusiasm was replaced by careful politeness and watchful waiting. When the final rituals ended, the Deccan had its first female ruler in centuries. But the real test would begin immediately, as external enemies and internal doubters prepared to challenge this extraordinary woman who dared to call herself king. Part 4. A Kingdom Inherited in Turmoil. The crown was heavy on Rudrama's head, but the weight of her kingdom's problems was far heavier. As she settled into her role as ruler, the true scale of the crisis became clear. The Kakatiya Empire that her father had built over decades was falling apart at its edges. The Pandya armies from the south had already taken the wealthy coastal lands. These territories had brought gold and trade goods into the royal treasury for generations. Now that income was gone, flowing instead into enemy coffers. The loss meant fewer coins to pay soldiers and fewer resources to defend what remained. From the northwest, the Yadava kingdom pressed harder each month. Their horsemen raided villages and burned crops along the border. They tested Kakatiya defenses constantly, looking for weak points where they could push deeper into the empire. Every raid that went unpunished encouraged bolder attacks. The eastern territories faced similar pressure from the eastern Ganga rulers. They had already seized important fortresses in the Kalinga region. These losses cut off trade routes and left loyal villages exposed to enemy raids. Local chiefs who had served the Kakatiyas for generations now wondered if they should switch sides. The feudal lords watched all this with growing concern. These powerful men controlled their own armies and lands under Kakatiya rule. They had pledged loyalty to Gajapati Devi because he was strong enough to protect them and reward their service. But could his daughter do the same? Many vassals whispered among themselves after official meetings. They questioned whether a woman could truly lead armies into battle. Medieval warfare demanded personal courage and physical presence on the battlefield. Kings were expected to fight alongside their soldiers, sharing the dangers of combat. Could Rudrama do this? Would her soldiers follow a female commander into deadly situations? The royal treasury reflected these military failures. Tax collection dropped as territory was lost. Trade declined because merchants feared traveling through war zones. The royal mines in lost territories no longer sent their silver and gems to Warangal. Meanwhile, the cost of defending the remaining lands kept growing. Rudrama's ministers brought her reports that painted a grim picture. Enemy forces were growing bolder. Local governors sent urgent requests for more troops and supplies. The royal army needed better equipment and higher pay to match enemy forces. But the money to provide these necessities was running short. The new queen understood that her enemies were counting on exactly this situation. They believed a woman could not hold together what her father had built. They expected the Kakatiya Empire to crumble from within as vassals lost confidence and soldiers refused to fight. But they had made a serious mistake. Rudrama had spent her entire life preparing for exactly these challenges. Her training in warfare and statecraft was about to be tested in the deadliest possible way. The skeptical lords and aggressive enemies were about to discover what kind of ruler they were really facing. Chapter 2. Forging the Iron Defense. Part 1. The Fortress Rises. Rudrama Devi understood that words meant little without walls to defend them. After establishing her rule, she turned her attention to a project that would reshape the very landscape of Warangal. The queen had seen how enemies tested weak rulers, and she refused to give them any chance. She ordered the greatest building project in Kakatiya history. Workers came from every corner of her kingdom, carrying massive granite blocks that weighed more than 10 men combined. The sound of hammers and chisels filled the air from dawn until dusk, as thousands of laborers began crafting what would become an impossible fortress to breach. Rudrama designed 3 rings of defense around Warangal. The innermost wall rose 29 feet high, built from solid granite blocks so perfectly fitted that not even a knife blade could slip between them. Each stone was carved with precision that amazed even the most skilled craftsmen of the time. Beyond this granite barrier, her engineers constructed a second wall made of earth, clay, and stone. This middle defense absorbed the impact of siege weapons, while providing elevated positions for her archers and defenders. The engineering required careful calculation of angles and heights to maximize defensive advantage. The third and outermost ring consisted of earthen ramparts protected by a moat that stretched 150 feet wide. Enemy armies would have to cross this water barrier under constant arrow fire before even reaching the first wall. The moat could be filled or drained depending on seasonal needs and defensive requirements. 45 massive towers called bastions punctuated these walls at strategic intervals. Each bastion housed weapons and provided overlapping fields of fire that left no blind spots for attacking forces. From these towers, defenders could rain arrows, stones, and burning oil on anyone foolish enough to approach Warangal with hostile intent. The Queen invested enormous resources in this project. Gold flowed from the royal treasury to pay skilled stonemasons, engineers, and laborers. She imported architectural knowledge from across India, combining the best defensive innovations into one impregnable system. Common people initially questioned the massive expense. Why spend so much on walls when the money could reduce taxes or fund public works? Rudrama knew the answer would come when enemy armies arrived at her gates and found themselves facing an impossible task. The psychological impact proved as important as the physical barrier. Word of Warangal's new defenses spread across India. Rival kings heard stories of walls that could not be broken and towers that commanded every approach to the city. This fortress would soon face its greatest test when enemies arrived believing they could crush a female ruler. Instead, they would discover that Rudrama Devi had created something that would define medieval Indian military architecture. The Queen had built more than walls. She had constructed a symbol of Kakatiya power that would endure for generations. Part 2. The Gajapati invasion repelled. The fortress walls of Warangal had barely settled when the first major test arrived. From the eastern kingdoms of Kalinga, King Veera Bhanudeva I of the Ganga dynasty gathered his armies with ambitious plans. He had heard the stories spreading across India about the Kakatiya queen, who now ruled from behind those impressive walls. Like many rulers of his time, he believed that a woman on the throne meant weakness and opportunity. Bhanudeva's invasion force moved southward along the coast, targeting the Kakatiya territories that stretched toward the sea. These lands were rich with ports and trade routes that fed wealth into Rudrama's treasury. The Ganga king calculated that striking here would force the queen to fight far from her fortified capital, exposing her military inexperience to his seasoned warriors. But Rudrama Devi had not spent years preparing for rule without learning the art of war. When reports reached Warangal of Ganga armies crossing into her coastal territories, she responded with decisive action that surprised her enemies. Rather than rushing out herself or sending a hastily assembled force, she deployed two of her most trusted commanders, Podinayaka and Prolinayaka. These generals had served her father and understood both the terrain and the enemy they faced. Rudrama gave them clear orders and the resources they needed, then trusted them to execute her strategy. This decision revealed something important about her leadership style. She knew when to lead from the front and when to direct from behind, choosing the approach that would bring victory rather than personal glory. The campaign that followed became a masterclass in defensive warfare. Podinayaka and Prolinayaka coordinated their forces to strike the Ganga invasion at multiple points. They used their knowledge of local geography to trap enemy units in unfavorable positions and cut off supply lines that stretched back to Kalinga. The decisive battles crushed Bhanudeva's hopes completely. His armies, expecting to face a confused defense led by an inexperienced queen, instead met coordinated resistance from commanders who fought with precision and confidence. The Ganga forces found themselves outmaneuvered and overwhelmed, forcing them into a retreat that became a rout. The victory brought immediate rewards for Rudrama's generals. They earned the prestigious title Simha to the Mata Gajapati, lion to the rutting elephant, recognizing their triumph over the Ganga forces whose symbol was the war elephant. This title became a source of pride throughout the Kakatiya realm, and a warning to other potential invaders. More importantly, this first major military test established Rudrama Devi's reputation across India. Kings who had been watching to see if she could actually defend her inheritance received a clear answer. The queen who built the fortress walls could also deploy armies with deadly effectiveness. She had chosen capable commanders, given them proper support, and achieved a victory that protected vital territory while demonstrating strength. The successful repelling of the Gajapati invasion marked the end of any illusions about Rudrama being a weak transitional ruler. Word spread that the Kakatiya queen commanded real military power and would use it decisively. This reputation would prove crucial as larger challenges approached, but for now, her coastal territories remained secure and her authority unquestioned. Part 3. Reclaiming the Coast. With coastal defenses proven effective, Rudrama turned her attention to a different challenge. Several valuable territories along the northern coastline had slipped from Kakatiya control during her father's final years. Local chiefs had grown bold, declaring themselves independent rulers. Some had even made deals with enemy kingdoms, hoping to gain protection and legitimacy. These lost lands were not just empty stretches of sand and rock. The coastal plains produced rich harvests that fed thousands of families. More importantly, the ports controlled sea trade routes that brought gold, spices, and precious goods from distant lands. Without these territories, the Kakatiya kingdom was losing substantial tax revenue every month that passed. Rudrama studied maps and reports from her spies. She knew exactly which areas needed to be reclaimed, and which local chiefs posed the biggest threats. Unlike the recent defensive victory against the Gajapatis, this would require a completely different approach. She would have to take back what belonged to her family through careful planning and sustained military pressure. The queen assembled her most trusted commanders for detailed planning sessions. They discussed which territories to target first and how to move troops efficiently across difficult terrain. Some areas could be retaken through negotiation and shows of strength. Others would require actual battles against well-fortified positions. Her first campaigns moved northward along the coast with methodical precision. Rudrama's forces approached each rebellious stronghold with overwhelming numbers and superior organization. Many local chiefs, seeing the disciplined Kakatiya armies approaching, quickly abandoned their declarations of independence. They remembered the power of her dynasty and chose submission over destruction. However, several chiefs refused to surrender their newfound freedom. These men had tasted independence and would not give it up easily. They fortified their positions and called upon their allies for support. Rudrama met their resistance with decisive military action, besieging their fortresses and cutting off their supply lines. The battles that followed demonstrated her growing confidence as a military leader. Rather than simply defending her inheritance, she was actively expanding and strengthening it. Each victory brought valuable ports and fertile farmlands back under Kakatiya control. More importantly, each success sent a clear message to other potential rebels about the consequences of defying her authority. The recovered territories provided immediate economic benefits. Trade revenues began flowing back into the royal treasury. Merchants who had avoided the unstable coastal regions returned to conduct business under Kakatiya protection. The successful reclamation of these strategic areas marked Rudrama's transformation from a defensive ruler protecting what she inherited to an aggressive monarch expanding her power through calculated military campaigns. Part 4. The 15-Day Siege of Warangal. By 1262, news of Rudrama's military successes had reached every court across the Deccan. Her victories had established her as a formidable ruler, but they also painted a target on her kingdom. Mahadeva of the Seuna Yadava dynasty looked at the growing Kakatiya power with alarm and opportunity. Here was a female ruler who had proven dangerous to ignore, yet surely she could be crushed with overwhelming force. Mahadeva assembled the largest army the Deccan had seen in decades. 300,000 infantry soldiers marched alongside 100,000 cavalry across the dusty roads toward Warangal. This was not a raiding party, or a border skirmish. This was total war designed to end the Kakatiya dynasty forever. The Yadava king believed that no matter how clever Rudrama might be, sheer numbers would overwhelm any defense she could mount. The massive Yadava army reached Warangal in the monsoon season of 1262. They spread across the landscape like a brown sea of soldiers, horses, and siege equipment. The sight would have terrified most rulers into immediate surrender. Mahadeva expected exactly that response. Female rulers were supposed to be weak, emotional, and quick to panic when faced with real military pressure. But when the Yadava forces looked up at Warangal's walls, they saw something unexpected. The triple fortifications that Rudrama had spent years perfecting now proved their worth. The outer earthen rampart stretched endlessly around the city. Behind it rose the middle wall, then the inner granite fortress that seemed to touch the sky. 45 massive stone towers glared down at the invaders, like watchful giants. For 15 days, the Yadava army pounded against these defenses. They filled the moat with earth and stones. They brought up siege ladders and battering rams. They shot thousands of arrows at the walls. Every attack met fierce resistance from defenders who had trained for exactly this moment. The triple walls absorbed every assault, while Kakatiya soldiers rained down death from the protected towers. Inside the fortress, Rudrama watched and waited. She had not built these walls simply to hide behind them. The defenses were buying her time to prepare something the Yadavas would never expect. While enemy soldiers exhausted themselves against stone and earth, she organized her own forces for a surprise that would end this siege permanently. On the 15th day, as dawn broke over the frustrated Yadava camp, the massive gates of Warangal suddenly burst open. Rudrama herself led the charge, mounted on her warhorse with her personal guard beside her. Behind them poured the entire Kakatiya army, fresh and furious after 2 weeks of watching enemies attack their home. The Yadava soldiers had spent over 2 weeks in constant fighting. They were tired, injured, and completely unprepared for a major offensive. When thousands of fresh Kakatiya warriors crashed into their ranks, the massive enemy army simply collapsed. What had seemed like an unstoppable force became a confused mob of fleeing soldiers. Mahadeva's great invasion ended in humiliating retreat. His supposedly invincible army scattered across the countryside, abandoning weapons and supplies in their desperate flight home. The siege that was meant to prove female rulers were weak had instead created a legend that would terrify enemies for decades. Part 5. The March to Devagiri. Rudrama stood atop the walls of Warangal, watching the last of Mahadeva's scattered army disappear into the distant hills. The air still smelled of smoke and blood from the battlefield below. Her advisors expected her to celebrate the victory and return to the palace. They thought driving off the massive invasion was enough. They were wrong. The queen's eyes followed the dusty trails leading west toward Yadava territory. For too long, her enemies had seen the Kakatiya kingdom as something to be conquered. They invaded her lands, threatened her people, and tested her resolve simply because she was a woman. Each attack taught them that such thinking was dangerous. But Rudrama realized that defensive victories alone would never end these challenges. Within days of the siege's end, she gathered her war council. The generals still celebrated their triumph, but Rudrama's mind was already planning the next move. She announced her intention to pursue the retreating Yadavas into their own territory. The council fell silent. No Kakatiya ruler had ever successfully invaded Yadava lands. The risk seemed enormous, but Rudrama saw opportunity where others saw danger. Mahadeva's army was broken and demoralized. The Yadava kingdom expected their forces to return home victorious, not as defeated refugees. The element of surprise belonged to her. She could strike before they had time to recover and reorganize their defenses. The march began before the monsoon rains could make the roads impassable. Rudrama led her army westward through the hill passes that separated her kingdom from Yadava territory. Her scouts reported that the enemy was indeed in complete disarray. Garrison commanders had no idea their main army had been destroyed. Local chiefs assumed any approaching forces were their own returning troops. The Kakatiya army moved swiftly through regions that had never seen foreign conquest. Village after village surrendered without resistance, their people confused by the appearance of disciplined troops led by a female commander. Word spread quickly that the legendary warrior queen was bringing war to the heartland of her enemies. Rudrama's primary target was Bidar Fort, a strategic stronghold that controlled the main routes between Yadava and Kakatiya territories. Capturing this fortress would give her a permanent foothold in enemy lands. More importantly, it would send a clear message that attacking her kingdom carried severe consequences. The siege of Bidar lasted only 3 days. The fortress commander had received no warning and no reinforcements. When Kakatiya catapults began hurling stones at the walls, the garrison realized they faced the same army that had just destroyed their kingdom's greatest military force. Surrender came quickly. Standing in the conquered fort, Rudrama had achieved something unprecedented. She was now the first and only Kakatiya ruler to successfully seize Yadava territory. The regional balance of power had shifted dramatically. Her kingdom was no longer just another prize to be conquered, but the dominant force that others feared to challenge. Chapter 3: The Empire Strikes Back. Part 1: The Southern Problem. The trouble brewing in the south had been simmering for decades, but now it threatened to boil over completely. Far below the Krishna River, the powerful Pandya dynasty ruled from their magnificent capital at Madurai. These southern kings had grown stronger with each passing year, and their hungry eyes looked northward toward Kakatiya lands. The Pandyas controlled territories that should have belonged to Rudrama. The coastal regions around Nellore were filled with Telugu-speaking people who shared the same language and culture as those in the Kakatiya heartland. Yet these areas remained under Pandya control, creating a constant source of tension. Every village chief, every local lord in these disputed territories faced an impossible choice daily. The feudal system that kept medieval kingdoms together worked like a web of personal promises. Local chiefs pledged loyalty to larger lords, who pledged loyalty to kings. But when two powerful kingdoms claimed the same territory, these promises became dangerous games. A chief might wake up one morning pledging loyalty to the Kakatiyas, then switch to the Pandyas by sunset if their armies looked stronger. This switching of sides happened constantly along the southern border. The Pandya kings understood this perfectly. They would march north with their armies, not always to fight, but to show their strength. When local Telugu chiefs saw thousands of Pandya soldiers camping nearby, many decided it was safer to bow to Madurai than to distant Warangal. The Pandyas were clever about this too. They let these chiefs keep their lands and their power, asking only for tribute and military support when needed. For Rudrama, this created an endless headache. Every few months, reports would arrive at her court telling of another chief who had switched sides. Sometimes entire regions would flip their loyalty overnight. The southern frontier felt like trying to hold water in cupped hands. Just when she thought she had secured an area, it would slip away again. The problem went deeper than simple border disputes. The Pandyas had formed alliances with remnants of the old Chola dynasty, creating a network of enemies along the entire southern edge of Kakatiya territory. These Telugu Chola vassals knew the local terrain, spoke the local language, and understood exactly which chiefs could be bought or threatened into changing sides. What made this situation truly dangerous was timing. The Pandyas were reaching the peak of their power just as Rudrama was establishing her authority as queen. Their aggressive rulers saw her reign as an opportunity. A woman on the throne meant weakness, they believed, a perfect moment to push north and grab valuable Telugu territories. This constant southern threat meant Rudrama could never rest. Her armies were always marching south, always fighting to hold territory that seemed to slip away the moment they left. The defense of these disputed lands consumed enormous resources and attention, creating the perfect conditions for other problems to grow unchecked elsewhere in her kingdom. Part 2: The Kayastha Power Play. Fighting the Pandyas in the south was expensive and exhausting work. Rudrama needed powerful local commanders who could hold these dangerous borders when she couldn't be there herself. This was where the Kayastha family became crucial to her kingdom's survival. The Kayastha brothers, Janaka and Tripurari Deva, controlled huge chunks of territory in the southern part of Rudrama's kingdom. Their lands stretched from Panugal all the way to Kaivaram Kota, forming a protective wall against Pandya attacks. These weren't just any nobles. They commanded their own armies, collected their own taxes, and ruled their territories almost like independent kings. This arrangement made perfect sense for everyone involved. Rudrama got reliable defenders for her most threatened border, without having to station her own expensive armies there permanently. The Kayastha brothers got rich and powerful by controlling trade routes and fertile farmland. Local people got protection from raids and invasions. The feudal system worked because it shared both power and responsibility. The Kayasthas weren't just military commanders taking orders from the capital. They were regional rulers in their own right, making daily decisions about taxes, justice, and defense. Their word was law in their territories, and local chiefs looked to them for leadership, not to distant Warangal. This independence was both blessing and curse. The Kayastha brothers built up massive wealth from controlling trade between the Telugu heartland and Tamil regions to the south. They recruited soldiers locally, men who owed loyalty to their immediate commanders rather than the queen far away. They settled disputes, granted land rights, and made alliances with neighboring chiefs. The more successful they became at defending against the Pandyas, the more powerful they grew within Rudrama's kingdom. Victory bred confidence. Wealth bred ambition. Military strength bred the temptation to use that strength for personal gain rather than royal service. The brothers understood they were essential to Rudrama's defense strategy. Without them, the southern border would collapse within months. This knowledge gave them leverage that ordinary vassals never possessed. They could make demands, negotiate terms, and push boundaries in ways that other nobles wouldn't dare attempt. The same geographic position that made them valuable defenders also isolated them from direct royal oversight. Weeks of travel separated their strongholds from Warangal. Royal messengers and inspectors couldn't easily monitor their activities or verify their loyalty. This distance created space for independent thinking and autonomous action. As Pandya pressure increased, the Kayasthas accumulated more soldiers, more territory, and more local support. They were becoming a state within the state, bound to Rudrama by increasingly fragile ties of feudal obligation. The system that should have strengthened her kingdom was quietly creating the seeds of its greatest internal threat. Part 3. Ambadeva's Ascension. When Ambadeva took charge of his family's territories in 1272, nobody expected what would come next. His older brothers had served the queen faithfully for years, controlling vast lands from the Krishna River down to the southern borders. But death and age had cleared the path for this younger, more ambitious brother to take control. At first, Ambadeva seemed like the perfect feudal lord. He rushed to defend the southern frontier whenever Pandya armies threatened. His soldiers fought hard against raiders trying to push north into Kakatiya lands. Queen Rudrama was so impressed that she gave him a special title, Raya Vibhada, meaning the pillar that holds up the kingdom. This honor showed how much she valued his military service and loyalty, but success can change a man's thinking. Each victory against southern enemies made Ambadeva more confident. He began to see himself not as a servant of the crown, but as a warrior king in his own right. His territories stretched across hundreds of miles. Thousands of soldiers followed his commands. Local Telugu chiefs looked to him for leadership instead of turning toward distant Warangal, where the queen held court. The subtle changes started appearing in official documents and stone inscriptions. Where his brothers had always mentioned serving under Queen Rudrama's authority, Ambadeva began using language that suggested he ruled by his own right. His declaration spoke less of loyalty to the crown and more of his independent power to protect and govern the region. Distance made these changes easier to hide. The southern territories lay far from the capital, separated by weeks of difficult travel. Royal messengers and officials couldn't easily check on what Ambadeva was really doing. This isolation gave him space to build his own power base without immediate interference from Warangal. Local chiefs began treating Ambadeva like their real ruler. They brought their disputes to him instead of appealing to the queen's court. They sought his permission for important decisions. They offered him tribute and military service. Slowly but surely, a parallel government was taking shape in the south. The presence of a female ruler made Ambadeva's growing ambitions seem more reasonable to many. Traditional thinking held that men should rule kingdoms, not women. Some local nobles whispered that perhaps it was time for a strong male leader to take charge. These ideas gave Ambadeva confidence that rebellion might actually succeed. By the mid-1270s, Ambadeva controlled what amounted to a separate kingdom within Rudrama's realm. His military strength rivaled the royal army. His territory generated enormous wealth. His political influence extended far beyond his official feudal grants. The loyal defender had quietly transformed into a potential rival, setting the stage for the greatest crisis of Rudrama's reign. Part 4. The Great Betrayal. The whispers of rebellion that had begun quietly in Ambadeva's court soon found powerful allies beyond the borders. The Pandya kings, ruling their vast territories from Madurai, saw an opportunity that seemed almost too good to pass up. Here was a chance to weaken their northern rival while supporting what they viewed as the natural order of things. To the Pandya rulers, the idea of a woman commanding armies and ruling territories went against everything they believed about proper governance. When Ambadeva's messengers arrived secretly in Madurai, carrying proposals for alliance, the Pandya court welcomed them warmly. They promised military support, financial backing, and recognition of Ambadeva's independence if he successfully broke away from Rudrama's control. By 1278, Ambadeva had made his choice. He stopped sending tribute to the royal capital. His inscriptions began dropping the formal language that acknowledged Rudrama as his sovereign. Instead, they spoke of him as an independent ruler, making grants and decisions as if he answered to no higher authority. The careful pretense of loyalty that had lasted for years finally cracked open. The rebellion spread like wildfire across the southern territories. Local chiefs who had long chafed under royal taxation and control saw their chance. If the powerful Ambadeva could break free successfully, perhaps they could too. One by one, feudal lords in the southern regions declared their support for the rebel cause. Rudrama faced an impossible situation. Every choice seemed to lead to disaster. If she negotiated with Ambadeva, it would show weakness and encourage more rebellions. If she offered him concessions, other feudatories would demand similar treatment. But if she responded with military force, she would drain the royal treasury and weaken her defenses against external enemies. The queen chose war. Royal armies marched south, while Ambadeva's forces prepared for battle. The kingdom that had once stood united against foreign threats now tore itself apart from within. Villages burned as rival forces clashed. Trade routes became dangerous battlegrounds. The prosperity that had marked Rudrama's early reign began crumbling as internal conflict consumed the realm's resources. The timing could not have been worse. While Kakatiya armies fought each other in the south, their traditional enemies watched with growing confidence. The Pandyas prepared for major territorial gains. The Yadavas sensed weakness in their old rivals. Even smaller neighboring kingdoms began planning attacks on what appeared to be a collapsing empire. What had begun as one ambitious feudatory's bid for independence had become a full-scale civil war that threatened everything Rudrama had worked to build. The Great Betrayal had succeeded in fracturing the kingdom's unity, creating the perfect conditions for the external invasions that would soon follow. Chapter 4. The Final Campaign. Part 1. The Southern Territories Lost. The loss of her southern provinces began like water slowly draining from a broken pot. Through the 1270s and 1280s, Ambadeva chipped away at Rudrama's kingdom, taking one fortress after another south of the Krishna River. Each victory made him bolder. Each defeat made her weaker. The fertile lands below the Krishna had always been the jewel of the Kakatiya realm. Rice paddies stretched like green carpets across the valleys. Trade routes carried silk and spices through busy market towns. These territories filled the royal treasury and fed the royal army. Now Ambadeva controlled it all. What made this betrayal burn deeper was how carefully he planned it. This wasn't a sudden revolt born of anger. Ambadeva had spent years building relationships with distant enemies. Messengers traveled secretly between his court and the Pandyan kingdom in the far south. Gold changed hands. Promises were made. Military advisors arrived disguised as merchants. The Pandyan kings saw their chance to wound the Kakatiyas without fighting them directly. They sent weapons, money, and experienced soldiers to help Ambadeva. More importantly, they gave him something Rudrama could never take away: legitimacy. When foreign rulers recognized Ambadeva as an independent king, local chiefs began to wonder if backing Rudrama was worth the risk. Rudrama fought back with everything she had. Her armies marched south again and again, trying to reclaim lost ground. But fighting a war in your own territory is like trying to repair a house while it burns around you. Every battle damaged something valuable. Every siege disrupted trade routes that fed her remaining provinces. Local chiefs found themselves caught between two fires. Supporting Rudrama meant facing Ambadeva's revenge if he won. Supporting Ambadeva meant being branded traitors if Rudrama crushed the rebellion. Many chose to wait and see who would emerge victorious. This hesitation weakened both sides, but hurt Rudrama more since she needed active support to maintain royal authority. The economic damage spread like poison through her kingdom. Merchants avoided war zones. Farmers abandoned fields near battlegrounds. Tax collectors found empty treasuries in districts that once overflowed with wealth. The southern territories hadn't just been lost, they were actively working against her, funding Ambadeva's armies with resources that should have strengthened her own forces. Meanwhile, other enemies watched from the borders like vultures circling wounded prey. The Yadavas in the north and various coastal chiefs saw opportunity in Kakatiya weakness. They began testing defenses, probing for soft spots, preparing their own moves. What started as one rebellion was becoming an invitation for total war. This internal bleeding would prove more dangerous than any external invasion Rudrama had faced. When enemies attack from outside, people unite against foreign threats. When enemies rise from within, they divide families, split loyalties, and turn neighbors into spies. The Kakatiya kingdom was slowly tearing itself apart, and everyone could see the wounds growing deeper. Part 2. The Alliance of Enemies. The year 1282 brought news that chilled Rudrama's court. Spies rushed in with reports that made everyone's blood run cold. The Pandyan brothers from the deep south were marching north with massive armies. But this wasn't just another border raid or territorial dispute. This was something far more dangerous. Jatavarma Sundara Pandya and Maravarma Kulasekara Pandya had spent months planning this invasion. They weren't coming alone. Secret messages had been flying between distant courts for months. Gold had changed hands. Promises had been made. What Rudrama now faced was her worst nightmare. All her enemies working together, like fingers on the same hand. The Pandyan armies crossed into Patapinadu with perfect timing. Just as their soldiers appeared on the southern borders, rebellion exploded across the Kakatiya kingdom. Samideva raised his banner in the east. Keshavadeva declared independence in another province. Local chiefs who had been quietly grumbling for years suddenly found their courage and joined the revolt. This wasn't coincidence. The coordination was too perfect, too well-timed. Messages had been passing between these rebels and the Pandyan court for months. Gold from the south had bought weapons for northern rebels. Promises of independence had turned former allies into bitter enemies. Rudrama's enemies had learned from past failures. Single rebellions could be crushed. Individual invasions could be repelled. But simultaneous attacks from all directions, that was different. Rudrama found herself fighting a war unlike any she had known. Her generals brought increasingly desperate reports each day. Enemy forces were advancing from the south, while rebels attacked supply lines in the north. Coastal forts fell to local chiefs who had received Pandyan gold. The kingdom was being strangled from multiple directions at once. The queen tried every strategy she knew. She sent diplomats to negotiate with some rebels, while her armies attacked others. She offered pardons to chiefs who would abandon the alliance. She moved troops frantically between different battlefronts, trying to shore up defenses wherever they cracked. But there were too many enemies and not enough soldiers. Each victory came at the cost of defeat elsewhere. When Rudrama's forces crushed one rebellion, two more erupted behind them. When she marched south to face the Pandyan invasion, northern rebels seized important towns. Her enemies had created a trap that tightened around her no matter which way she moved. The kingdom that had once stretched from sea to mountain was shrinking like a puddle in summer heat. Towns that had paid tribute for decades suddenly flew enemy banners. Trade routes that had enriched the royal treasury now funded rebellion. The wealth and power that Rudrama had spent 30 years building was crumbling under coordinated assault from enemies who had finally learned to work together. By late 1283, the situation had become desperate. The greatest threat of Rudrama's reign was squeezing her kingdom from every direction. The warrior queen who had never backed down from any fight now faced enemies who understood that her greatest strength, her refusal to surrender, could become her fatal weakness. Part 3. The Battle of Chandupatla. By 1289, 6 years of constant warfare had pushed Rudrama to her breaking point. Her southern territories remained in enemy hands. Her treasury was nearly empty from funding endless campaigns. Her allies had grown weary of supporting what seemed like a losing cause. At 64 years old, the warrior queen faced a choice that would define her legacy forever. Ambadeva had grown bold in his rebel strongholds south of the Krishna River. He now styled himself as the rightful ruler of the southern provinces. His forces had grown stronger with Pandyan gold and weapons. Local chiefs who had once served Rudrama now sent tribute to her former vassal. The rebellion that had started as one man's defiance had become a breakaway state, threatening to split the Kakatiya kingdom in half. Rudrama's advisors urged caution. They wanted her to negotiate, to accept the loss of the southern territories in exchange for peace. Some even suggested she should step aside and let her grandson Prataparudra handle the crisis. But the queen, who had spent 30 years proving that a woman could rule as fiercely as any man, refused to surrender her authority to save her life. In the summer of 1289, Rudrama made her decision. She would lead one final campaign against Ambadeva personally. This would not be a war fought by generals while she remained safe in Warangal. The aging queen would take direct command of her forces and settle this rebellion herself. It was a gamble that risked everything she had built. But Rudrama had never been one to choose safety over honor. The royal army that marched south toward Chandupatla was smaller than the forces Rudrama had led in her younger days. Years of warfare had depleted her manpower. Many veteran warriors had died in previous campaigns. Some feudatories had switched sides or remained neutral rather than risk more losses. But those who followed their queen south were the most loyal soldiers in the kingdom, men who believed in her leadership despite the odds. Chandupatla became the stage for what everyone knew would be the decisive battle. Ambadeva had chosen his ground well, positioning his forces on elevated terrain with strong defensive positions. His army included not just rebel Kakatiyas, but Pandyan auxiliaries and mercenaries. The banners flying over his camp told the story of how far the rebellion had spread. As Rudrama surveyed the enemy positions, she understood the stakes completely. This battle would determine whether she remained a queen or became a footnote in someone else's story. The woman who had broken every rule to rule would now fight to prove she deserved to keep ruling. The stage was set for a confrontation that would end either in triumph or tragedy. Part 4. The Warrior Queen Falls. Rudrama saw the first arrows darkening the sky before dawn fully broke over Chandupatla. Her army had taken position during the night, but Ambadeva's forces were already moving. The queen gripped her sword tighter as she watched enemy formations spread across the field like a dark tide. The battle began with the clash of cavalry wings. Rudrama had positioned her best horsemen to strike first, hoping to break Ambadeva's lines before his superior numbers could tell. For a brief moment, it seemed to work. Her cavalry smashed into the rebel left flank, driving them back toward the hills. But Ambadeva had learned from decades of warfare. His Pandyan allies held firm in the center, while fresh troops poured down from the elevated positions. What started as a Kakatiya advance quickly turned into desperate fighting as more enemy soldiers joined the battle. Rudrama rode where the fighting was thickest. Her presence steadied wavering troops, but the odds kept growing worse. By midday, her army was being pushed back on all sides. The woman who had defeated the mighty Yadavas now faced the bitter truth that sometimes courage was not enough. The exact moment of her death remains disputed by chroniclers. Some say she fell fighting beside her standard, sword in hand, refusing to retreat even as her bodyguards begged her to flee. Others claim she died during the chaotic withdrawal, struck down as she tried to rally her scattered forces for one final charge. What all accounts agree on is that Rani Rudrama Devi died as she had lived. No palace death for this queen, no peaceful surrender to preserve her life. She chose the battlefield over the treaty table, combat over compromise. When news of her death spread, the immediate response was panic. Her army scattered, some fleeing north toward Orugalu, others simply melting away into the countryside. Ambadeva's forces occupied the battlefield, claiming victory over the woman who had ruled for nearly 3 decades. But Ambadeva's triumph was brief. Even as he celebrated, urgent messages were racing north. Prataparudra, Rudrama's chosen successor, was already gathering loyal forces. The young prince had inherited more than just his grandmother's throne. He carried her determination, her military knowledge, and her refusal to accept defeat. The power vacuum created by Rudrama's death lasted only weeks. By late November 1289, Prataparudra had secured the capital and begun organizing his response. The rebellion that had killed his grandmother would soon face a new generation of Kakatiya resistance. Rudrama's death on the battlefield became her final statement about queenship. She had ruled as a warrior, not a symbol. She had led armies, not ceremonies. Her last act proved that she would rather die fighting for her kingdom than live as someone else's prisoner. Part 5. The Grandson's Inheritance. Prataparudra stood in his grandmother's war room, studying the maps that showed how much territory the rebellion had torn away. Red marks covered the southern regions where Ambadeva's forces held control. The young king understood that talking would not bring these lands back. Only war could restore what his family had ruled for generations. The new king moved quickly. He gathered the same generals who had served Rudrama, men who knew how to fight the battles she had taught them. The Nyankara system his grandmother had built still worked. Local commanders controlled small armies throughout the kingdom. These men knew their territories and could move fast when orders came from the capital. Ambadeva had expected the kingdom to collapse after Rudrama's death. He thought the nobles would fight each other for power. Instead, Prataparudra proved that royal blood still mattered. The rebels who had gained confidence during the chaos suddenly faced organized resistance again. The first battles came in early 1290. Prataparudra led his forces south toward the rebel strongholds. The young king fought with the same fierce energy that had made his grandmother famous. He did not just send armies. He rode with them, showing that Kakatiya rulers still led from the front. Battle after battle, the royal forces pushed deeper into rebel territory. Ambadeva's supporters began switching sides when they saw that Prataparudra would not give up. The rebellion that had seemed so strong started falling apart. Local chiefs who had joined the revolt remembered that the Kakatiyas had ruled these lands for over a century. The final confrontation came when Prataparudra cornered Ambadeva's main force. The battle lasted all day. When it ended, the Kayastha leader lay dead on the field. The rebellion that had killed Rudrama died with its leader. Prataparudra had won back most of the southern territories within 2 years of taking the throne. But he learned something important from these campaigns. The kingdom his grandmother had left him was smaller than before. The wars had cost money, soldiers, and time. Most dangerous of all, these internal fights had caught the attention of a much bigger enemy. Reports from the north brought troubling news. The Delhi Sultanate had finished conquering other kingdoms. Their armies were looking south toward the Deccan. Prataparudra realized that defeating Ambadeva was just the beginning. His grandmother had fought rebels and neighboring kings. He would have to fight an empire. The young king began preparing for this greater threat. He strengthened the fortresses Rudrama had built. He expanded the army using her military system. He studied the reports about how Delhi's armies fought. Everything his grandmother had created would soon face the ultimate test against an enemy unlike any the Kakatiyas had ever encountered.